So good morning, everyone. Welcome to this Autism Training and Technical Assistance Project webinar. My name is Kirsten Bayer with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support, and we are excited to welcome you to today's topic. We are joined back with Hallie Moss, and we're so excited to have her. She just presented and led two panels and just did so much work for us last week at our autism conference if you were joining us at that or if you joined virtually. So you're probably very familiar with her and her work and her face. And we've had her on multiple webinars for our project in the past. So we're excited to welcome her back to talk about knowing your rights and self-advocating autism and the law. You can go ahead to the next slide for me. Thank you. Like I said, my name is Kirsten Bayer. I'm the Assistant Director of Communications here at ICSPS. Here's my contact information if you need to contact me following today's webinar. We do offer certificates of participation for today's webinar. So if you need a certificate of participation, you can feel free to email me after today's webinar, and I'm happy to provide that to you. You can go ahead to the next slide. Just a little bit about our project if you don't know who we are. So we are the Autism Training and Technical Assistance Project. We are funded by the Illinois State Board of Education. We love acronyms in the state work, if you don't know. So we call ourselves ADA. And we develop resources that assist individuals specifically when they're transitioning from secondary to post-secondary education or when they're transitioning from secondary to employment. So all of our professional development is geared towards stakeholders that are in the secondary and post-secondary system, as well as parents, family members, and individuals with autism or autistic individuals to support them as they're transitioning from after they're in the secondary system with all of the support that the secondary system provides to what does that look like if you're transitioning to the post-secondary system where there sometimes isn't as much support depending on the university or community college, or to employment where we know there is not as much support depending on the employer as well. So that's kind of our project and what we focus on. If you want to go to the next slide, our project is housed with us at our center. So our center has multiple projects, a couple of which are funded by ISB. ICSPS, or the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support, we are housed in the Educational Administration and Foundations Department within the College of Ed at ISU in Bloomington Normal, Illinois. We have been around since 1977, and really our mission is always to encourage professionals to educate equitably and offer expertise in creating those learning environments. We specifically focus on enhancing recruitment, retention, and embracing that growth mindset to support special population students. We do a lot of work with universal design for learning, and we specifically focus on providing access, diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as focusing all of those things being accessible and equitable in terms of recruitment, retention, and completion for those students. You can go ahead to the next slide. Here is our website for this project. It's autismcollegeandcareer.com. I can put that in the chat here momentarily, but you will also receive a follow-up email tomorrow that will not only have that website URL in it, but will also have a follow-up survey from today's webinar. And I highly encourage you to participate in that. It just helps us when planning future professional development and letting us know what topics that you would like to see, as well as giving Hallie some feedback for her presentations that she gives us. Like I said, we are funded by ISB, and the webinar today is being recorded, and the slides and the webinar from the recording will also be posted on that website following today's webinar. I will say that it takes usually about 48 business hours to get that posted. So just give us a little bit of time, but you'll have the URL where you can access it tomorrow in your follow-up email. Just along with that, we are on the Zoom webinar platform. If you're not as familiar with it, you'll notice that as an attendee, you do not have your microphone or video capabilities. It's just a little bit more of a presenter audience format of a platform, but we do encourage your participation. You can participate via the chat, and let me just go ahead and make sure my settings always like to turn off on me. So I just opened the chat for everybody. So you should be able to put in there if you'd like to say good morning or hello to us. So you can participate in the chat. You can also type questions in the Q&A. And then at the very end of the webinar, Hallie is so great and she always allows time for Q&A live. So if you would like to ask her a live question, you can feel free to do so at the end of the presentation. You can raise your Zoom virtual hand, and then I actually can give you your microphone capability back and unmute you. But for just to get through the presentation and for sake of time, we'll keep the microphones closed for the time being. You can go ahead to the next slide. I believe the next thing that we have is just to do our beginning ADA polls that we do every webinar. And this is just for our analytical purposes. We do have a autism training and technical assistance project. I'm blanking on the term, excuse me. We do have like a not a board, but we do have like a committee of stakeholders. Basically, we have a couple employers on there. We have people from Illinois Community College Board. We have people from the Illinois State Board of Education that sit on it. And we do meet multiple times a year to discuss professional development that the system needs. And we also go over these analytics because we want to make sure that we are hitting the whole state of Illinois. We want to serve the whole state from the very tippy top to the bottom. So just this first poll, which region are you located in, really helps us to be able to determine if we're meeting everybody where you all are at. And then also which ADA stakeholder do you represent? These are all of our stakeholders that we want to hit. And so we want to make sure we're getting good representation across the board. So I'll give you guys a couple more seconds to answer those polls. I see a couple of good mornings in the chat. That's awesome. Mallory says that she needs a certificate, but missed my email. So I will put my email in the chat here right now for any of you that need a certificate of participation after today. Then you can go ahead and email me and I'm happy to provide that to you. All right, I'll go ahead and end this poll and share the results just to debrief really quickly. Looks like we have a good portion of people from Chicago and Northeast Illinois, and a couple people sprinkled throughout Northwest, Central, and Southern. And then we have a lot of secondary educators on with us today and post-secondary educators, as well as community members, family members. We have one student or young adults and two employers with us. So a good span of people across our audience today. So that's awesome. Thank you all for joining us so much. I'm going to hand it off to Hallie. You can just go to the next slide and skip it there and let her get started with her presentation. And if anybody has any questions for me logistically, feel free to type them in the chat. I'm happy to respond to you.
Thank you so much, and good morning, and hello to everybody who is taking the time out of their very busy days to join us. I'm so excited to be here and to have this great conversation with you all about knowing your rights and a little bit more. Most of our focus today is primarily going to be on employment and also law enforcement and crime. Those are usually the things that people have the most questions on when it comes to our rights as autistic people and what to do in those different situations. A lot of the times they can be very fraught, like, what am I doing with accommodations? What happens if I get pulled over? What happens if I am stimming in public and a police officer thinks it's suspicious? These are some of the things that I get asked about a lot. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Haley. I am an autistic person. I am an attorney by trade and an educator by choice is usually how I like to describe myself. I am the author of several books about neurodiversity and self-advocacy and autism. I love getting to help people however I can. And this is truly just my passion. I loved being in private law practice, but I love getting to interact with you all a lot more. And I am here if you guys need anything, any questions. You can also contact me in the way that feels most accessible to you. So I do have my information up just to kind of give you that option. I can always come back to this later, and I will make sure that the slides are able to get out to you as well and that they're accessible as possible. So kind of, we're going to just jump right in actually and start with kind of an overview of major disability rights legislation. For those of you who might not be as familiar with disability rights, historically, what has happened at the federal and state levels is that most disability rights that we have come from legislation. Legislative achievement has been the big barometer of success when it comes to disability rights more broadly. That we do have court interpretations, but they don't always create new rights. They might try to clarify the rights that come up in other pieces of legislation. But really, what ends up happening is the legislation ends up getting kicked back and then essentially modified because courts don't always interpret it correctly. This is something that happened with the ADA when it was passed in 1990. There were revisions that came, I believe, in 2008. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit under the weather today. My brain is a little bit foggy. I apologize in advance. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but there was an ADA amendment not too long ago, mostly to clear up stuff that courts were doing. And what happens here is there are also court-specific rights that are enshrined in some way, shape, or form. So there are court cases that are very seminal when it comes to disability rights that essentially do guarantee different types of rights and will clarify what is expected. So some of the big ones that usually come up when we think about court cases is stuff like Olmstead versus LC. For those of you who are involved with home and community-based living and services, Olmstead's a really big one to make sure that people are essentially able to receive services in the community rather than in institutions, essentially. And then there are also different clarifiers, such as I know a couple of years ago in 2017 was the Andrew F. decision from the Supreme Court, which basically meant that IEPs under the Individuals Disabilities Education Act needed to just do more than de minimis and actually be appropriate and challenge the student and further their goals. Basically, we can't just mail it in on an IEP, which sounds pretty straightforward, but we had to actually get that enshrined, and courts help clarify or try to restrict some of the meaning, but really a lot comes from legislation. But thankfully, with disability rights, there's only three major pieces of federal law to be thinking about. And those are the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So let's start with the ADA to kind of get that overview of what this is it really is that comprehensive federal civil rights law that really just prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities. It is divided into five titles, dealing with situations such as employment, that's Title I, state and local government services and entities, that's Title II, public accommodations, Title III, telecommunications, Title IV, and a catch-all provision for anything that's not covered under the previous four titles and Title V. Basically, everything that falls under the ADA is pretty massive. It can include things like our housing rights, healthcare, employment, state and local and federal government services and programs. I know that seems very comprehensive, but essentially, this non-discrimination against people with disabilities affects all of these different things. So it might show up in housing, such as can you have an emotional support or service animal because you're autistic? The answer, cut and dry in that regard, is yes. If they are discriminating against you because of that, absolutely you have rights under the ADA. Whether or not you have gone through the proper channels to register your service animal, you have your medical documentation, what have you, that's all very individual. I'm not providing specific case legal advice today. I am not licensed to practice law in the state of Illinois. So I am mostly just giving an overview to help empower you guys to make good decisions and to also have a little bit of knowledge and also give resources. We also have healthcare, so you're able to receive accommodations from healthcare providers, whether that's telehealth or in person. Essentially, healthcare needs to be accessible. Employment, we're going to get into the weeds a little bit more when we do talk about accommodations and discrimination at work. That's usually a very big topic of concern, especially with our transition age young people. And then there's also stuff with government and social services. So, autistic people who are receiving things like Medicaid, who might be accessing vocational rehab, who might be using Social Security or receiving Social Security. A lot of that, I am very honest when I talk about. I am not the right person to get into the details with on SSI, Social Security income, Social Security disability income, or SSDI, Medicaid. I am not your girl for that. I mean that with nothing but love, but it is beyond my pay grade. It's a very complex web of different services and law and different policy considerations. There are people who know that way better than I do, and I'm very honest about that. Moving on, we do have another piece, which is kind of the precursor to the ADA, and that is the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. For those of you who are disability rights geeks, this is really the first major piece of legislation. And Section 504 is probably the one that most of you think of. If you are a history buff when it comes to disability rights, this is the one that had the protests in the 70s and the legacy of Judy Heumann and the occupation of federal buildings to have enforced. But really, when it comes to the Rehabilitation Act, there are two major sections that people are usually thinking about. The first is Section 503 for those of us who are working with federal agencies, that there are different aspirational affirmative action goals for recruiting, hiring, and employment for people with disabilities. In federal agencies, their contractors and subcontractors. They aren't always necessarily enforced, but a lot of them are aspirational, so there's an ideal hiring amount. 503 is partially why you might see job applications and whatnot ask people to disclose disability status, even though you're afraid that this is nerve-wracking, this is going to be a problem. And they say it's for data purposes. It's usually because of 503 and there's someone that is receiving some kind of federal dollars. That is part of their goal to hit that aspirational goal that's laid out under 503. But 504 is the really big one that most of us might be more familiar with. I know we have a lot of educators joining us today, and this is also where our good old-fashioned 504 plan gets its name from. That essentially, this is again the precursor, and it is important for anything that receives federal funding. So there's non-discrimination on the basis of disability in anything that is receiving federal funding. The ADA applies to pretty much anything, and it does not have that federal funding restriction on it. This is also why 504 is what tends to govern schools and universities and colleges as well as the ADA, but this can also usually fall under 504. And of course, I know many of us who are educators are very familiar with the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, and IDEA essentially is for that free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment up until age 22 or high school graduation, whichever comes first, that this is also how students and young people will get access to diagnoses. They might also have different interventions under there. They also have IEPs or individualized education plans that are governed under this piece of legislation. And those things are all part of that goal of making sure that students with disabilities do receive public education if they so choose and their families choose to enroll them in public school. Before IDEA came into effect, you had students who either didn't go to school, homeschooled, institutionalized, a little bit of that. So this is something that's very important. When you look at the historical context of disability law, I always like to kind of start with, I know this seems pretty bare bones. It doesn't seem like it's enough. It doesn't feel like a lot. But if you look at where we've come from, it is quite the improvement from people just being warehoused. And we are going to talk about each of these just a little bit more when it comes to how they interact with different things in real life. But I do want to kind of touch on, is there any specific like autism law? Because sometimes people ask me these questions a lot. Is there anything specific to autism? And the answer is only when it comes to funding. Is that every couple of years we have the Autism Cares Act that gets reauthorized to basically have more money come in. I believe it is funded through either 2027 or 2029 right now because it was reauthorized, I believe, in the past administration. And basically, what happens, there's not much outside of Autism Cares. Autism Cares is the only piece at the federal level. Everything else is at state and local. So it might be stuff that's at the state level or things that are at, say, your own municipality or city or town doing something good. So there's no requirement, for instance, to have sensory-friendly businesses. I know a lot of municipalities, counties, and certain cities and whatnot really take this seriously over the past couple of years. I know my local area has really gone hard on the sensory-friendly businesses and training different places like museums. I know there are cities that are kind of aiming for an autism-friendly designation. I went on a press trip a couple of years ago to somewhere in North Carolina that was designated as an autism-friendly destination for vacations. And a lot of the buildings and businesses had sensory training and sensory accommodations and things built into it. So everybody was sort of in the know. But other things that you might see at state and local levels are things like driver's license initiatives. This is something that is very controversial. I am from Florida. Florida has a driver's license initiative that essentially individuals with developmental disabilities can choose to have a marker. It's a choice to have this marker on their driver's license or identification that basically says they're a person with a developmental disability. In Florida, it's that you can have AD printed on your driver's license. The fact that it's a choice is the only reason I am like, you know what, if that's something that feels right for you and your family, that's fine. Personally, not for me. But if this was required, I'd feel very different. And I know that a lot of us are having a lot of feelings because of what goes on in the news when it comes to registries and different autism funding and initiatives. But this is what is kind of the standard essentially. And the other thing that happens at the local level is police trainings. We'll talk about police trainings in a moment. Full disclosure, I have led police trainings in the past. I have helped develop them, but we have a lot of thoughts on them generally. And then, of course, for federal level stuff, we do have lots of nonpartisan groups that are doing their work on disability and autism policies. So if you want to know a little bit more, you can also see what the National Council on Disability has done, the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee. They take comments from the public. There are members of the public who are a part of this. They meet, I believe, every couple of months. And there's also the Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy, or ODEP. ODEP is also responsible for so many of the great programs and resources some of you might have in your toolkit as well. So I know for many of us who have used the Job Accommodation Network, that was a program and initiative that was funded by the Department of Labor and in coordination with ODEP. And I know ODEP has worked with many other universities and initiatives as well that I have also been lucky enough to partner on over the years. So that is what's specific to autism per se when it comes to law and policy. But there are also just basic rights that we have. And this is just being human. I apologize for a minute. And when it comes to that, we are entitled to fair treatment, respect, and dignity and full participation in society. That is something I know that seems very obvious, but sometimes people forget that people with disabilities have the same rights as pretty much anybody else. There might be additional protections, especially if discrimination or some kind of other civil rights violation happens on the basis of disability. But something really important to keep in mind is that everything that comes in regard to disability interacts with almost everything. And I know we touched on this earlier, but I always like to make it clear is that law doesn't always exist in a vacuum either. So even if you're dealing with something that, say, falls under the Fair Housing Act, and it might be a fair housing question, it can still involve disability law and disability can still be a part of that equation. Same with something that might or might not be related to education, social services and benefits, employment, or somebody's healthcare. That's non-exhaustive, but that's just something I want us to be thinking about. And also when we think about our rights as accused or just interacting with law enforcement and crime and police. So I know crime is the big one people like to talk about, or they don't really talk about that often because it's kind of a scary thing to think about is a lot of us know that autistic people do interact with law enforcement and do end up being people who participate in the criminal justice system. I'm not necessarily that saying that means that we're guilty or we're all doing bad things, but there are people who are accused, wrongfully accused, witnesses, people who have interacted with law and not always in a good way. But typically, when it comes to law enforcement, we are more likely to experience victimization, arrest, charges, or if you do get convicted, you're more likely to serve a longer prison sentence than those without disabilities. I know this is kind of scary to think about, and also why it's important that we keep people safe. I know that even if you're a victim of a crime as a person with a disability, the way that you communicate with police or the way that you communicate with investigators can also be seen as an issue, that perhaps you're going to be very nervous. Maybe you seem suspicious. Maybe they think you're lying because you're not making eye contact. All sorts of different stuff kind of interacts here. And there's also a lot of people in the incarcerated population currently that is estimated to have an intellectual or developmental disability compared to the general population. It's supposed to be higher. That what seems to happen is you have a lot of folks who are undiagnosed or do have these conditions and end up on the wrong side of the law. And the same even goes for those who meet the criteria for an autism diagnosis but might not have one. That male inmates in particular, about 9% of them met the criteria for ASD, even though they weren't necessarily all diagnosed. And something else worth pointing out here is this happens a lot when you see young people on the spectrum getting caught up with the justice system, is that there's a lot of kind of back and forth over if there should be sort of leniency or different things regarding autism as a defense to crimes. And I know that usually we think this might fall under not guilty by reason of insanity, guilty but mentally ill, all of these other defenses, but there's nothing that is a specific autism defense. And this is something depending on how you feel, you might think there should be or there should not be. Usually, when I talk to people, they have mixed feelings on this too, of, there should be something specific, but then you talk to other people who think that autistic people should be treated the exact same way as anybody else, and they're not necessarily special in the eyes of the law somehow. But that's part of that equation is how do we deal with this? You could still also have, for instance, a jury instruction that instructs jurors to account for a person's autism if they're on trial and what that means and if that might interact with their decisions or the case at hand. That might be that sort of middle ground that feels fair. And also, this is something I talk about a lot, especially when I do presentations on women and masking, is that people with autism and intellectual and developmental disabilities are more likely to be victims of assault and abuse. Just some stuff to keep in mind is we're more likely to be victims than perpetrators, but sometimes you do have it possible that you are on the wrong side. Usually, the things that will show up if you do a lot of reading on kind of what's popular when it comes to autism and crime, you might see a lot of people who unknowingly do the wrong thing. And this has something I've seen with sex crimes in particular that's been throughout the news over the last decade or so is people who are accessing, say, for instance, child pornography, but they don't realize something is wrong or they don't realize that that's not okay. There's all sorts of different things that happen that they don't know they're doing something wrong. So it really is important to have that education when it comes to crime and what this might look like. And that also comes for interacting with police. And when it comes to interacting with police, even if you did not do something or our young people haven't done anything wrong, which happens all the time, is that nearly 20% of us will have some kind of encounter or a run-in with law enforcement before you're 21 years old. And about half of those will happen before someone turns 15, which is absolutely terrifying to think about. And when I talk about this and I talk about run-ins with the law or interactions with police, I have done police trainings and I've also been stopped by police before I was 21. Actually, I was 21. And I was stopped just for walking through a place that was frequented by teenagers that had a curfew at night. And I was very nervous. I was 21. I was bringing home a pizza actually from my local pizza place, and there was a mall, like a shopping center mall on the way home, and I would always cut through there because it was the quicker way to get home, and I don't like walking home alone at night. And I remember very much getting stopped by an officer on my way home. I don't know if I was stimming or looking the wrong way or something seemed off about me, but I remember getting stopped, being told I wasn't supposed to be there because of the curfew. I, of course, was lawfully there. I was over the age of the curfew, which was 16 or 17. I was 21. I'm aware that I have a baby face. And I was still very scared and didn't know, like, do I just explain to him that I'm over 18? Do I drop my pizza? What do I do? Because I saw that gun or taser in the holster and was freaked out. So it's a very natural thing that autistic people have this fear of police. Thankfully, I was able to just explain, like, hey, I'm a student at the university. I'm of age. I'm just trying to take my pizza home. And he let me just move on with my life. But it was still a little bit scary. The same if you've ever been in a car accident before and you have to explain what had happened. That many of us have this fear of interaction, but thinking that these happen on the basis of autism is also pretty scary. That our natural behaviors and inclinations might appear suspicious to first responders generally. So something I remember a story several years ago about a young man on the spectrum waiting for his local library to open. And he was pacing back and forth because that was his stim or his nervous habit, what have you. And the immediate thought was that he was casing the area to rob something, when really he was just nervous and waiting for the local library to open. And of course, they questioned him and he just wanted to go to the library. But these things can also turn deadly or result in a lot of harm. So there was a case, I believe, in the last month or two related to a young teenager named Victor Perez who was autistic with cerebral palsy that a neighbor called the cops. They thought there was some kind of altercation in the backyard, and he was essentially shot. He was on life support. Family took him off, so the cops essentially killed this kid. And it was really something that the autistic community has a lot of feelings about and is really hoping to see more justice for. You see these as well with young people and over the years, so just a couple of them, and they're all throughout the country. It's not just an isolated thing. I know there was Arnaldo Rios was in my backyard about 10 years ago. And what happened there is that you had a guy who was working and living. You had a caregiver who was working there, and you had a young man who lived in a group home. And he was playing with a toy truck or something, and they shot at the caregiver. But they said they meant to shoot the autistic guy because he had something in his hand that they perceived as dangerous when it was just a toy truck. And keeping that in mind and realizing there is a disability correlation with brutality and violence is really big. So it's important to keep our people safe. I know this is something I have to stress when it comes to knowing your rights and how to interact with law enforcement, but there's also so much more that we could be doing in this arena, which really is how do we educate our community? And I know as well, we also have school resource officers for those who have been in public school and have interacted with law enforcement in that way. That's also very common. I know living in Florida that for restraint and all that, that sometimes the Baker Act, which can essentially put involuntary mental health holds and hospitalizations on people, is part of that because otherwise these are students who end up getting arrested just for having difficult behaviors in the classroom. Like it's ridiculous when I say it, but that's stuff that happens as a matter of poor policy, essentially. And when we think about what these educational tools will look like, I do want to be very mindful as well that we do have a lot of departments that want to do the right thing and do the right thing. I know pretty much most of my local cities and towns here will have the autism police car every April, but I don't always know what they're doing all year long outside of that. But a lot of them do have autism and disability awareness training, but there's nothing that's really standard across that. So who is delivering those trainings? I know the local people who do it here are connected with the university, that a former lieutenant from one of the police departments who is the father of an autistic kid does a lot of them, that all sorts of stuff like that. So in the length and the level of knowledge covered in there and information is so variable. And also there's lots of other initiatives to help make things better. So one of the big ones that took place for a very long time, and I don't have as much information on currently, was special cards to indicate disability and autism. Think of how when you go to the airport, some people do the lanyards and will disclose that there were initiatives when I was a teenager, especially to have these different cards in your wallet to disclose safely and explain what autism was to somebody. I used to have them in my glove box of my car. But as time goes on, I realize that I might be too frazzled to ask an officer to reach for a card and give it to him. And also, if I pull it out of my glove box without permission, they might think I'm going for a weapon. So, keeping those things in mind might be important when we talk about this with young people and how we can do better. Which also means there's stuff that as a community we can do to help really enforce our rights. And really, that means that we have community programs that we keep people safe, since a lot of the time it isn't crime that ends up getting us in trouble. What ends up getting us in trouble is just behavior that people don't know what to do with, whether that is pacing in front of a library or having a meltdown in public. I cannot tell you how many times people have had meltdowns in public and it ends up with a police officer involved. That these meltdowns are not being treated as mental health or disability events, but rather something that needs to have law enforcement involved out of fear for somebody's safety, which means as an autistic person or their family and supporters, one of the best things that we could do to help make sure our rights are enforced is have some kind of crisis or safety plan. Not just for an emergency like a tornado or a hurricane, but if you have a meltdown in public, like, are we going to go to a quiet place? Are we going to advocate for ourselves and others that there is no need to intervene to a bystander who thinks that calling the cops might be the best situation to have here? And also having that awareness and those partnerships. So if you haven't had partnerships with law enforcement, that might be a good thing to look into. And also knowing which behaviors look suspicious to neurotypicals is really big. I know this is kind of complicated and messy to talk about, but I do realize that stims especially really seem to throw them off and make neurotypicals think that something is wrong or suspicious, even though many of us as professionals and people with lived experience know that's not the case, that self-regulation looks different for different people. So a little bit for my autistic people here of how to have these interactions and how to make them go safely is that your traits might be interpreted as suspicious, like we talked about, and don't attempt to leave without permission. I know this is a big one, and I know we immediately just want to be cooperative or just say anything and do anything to get out of a situation. Don't make that your default. I know that seems like a good idea because that's the people pleaser in many of us. But really, if you attempt to flee, when they're trying to talk to you or they want to talk to you, you might be viewed as resisting or being uncooperative, and that might give them a reason to arrest you or something else, even though that's obviously not what the intent is. And of course, if you are questioned on anything, you do have rights under Miranda versus Arizona, which is the big court case that basically says you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court, and you have the right to an attorney. And if you can't afford one, one will be provided for you in criminal situations. Basically, what you need to do if this is something that happens to you, this is not, of course, legal advice, but make it very clear that you're invoking your rights under Miranda. And sometimes the easiest way to do that is to make it not ambiguous and say, I want a lawyer. It's that simple. It's not an admission of guilt, and it's not the same as saying, I think I want to talk to a lawyer. I think I want to talk to a lawyer is not the same as I want a lawyer. When you script these types of interactions, they need to be non-ambiguous. Think is ambiguous in this case. So you want to make sure that you are being as straightforward as humanly possible in order to make sure that these things go smoothly. And of course, there are throughout the entire court process and throughout even just different things in these in having lawyers and interacting with lawyers, we also fall under the ADA and have to give accommodations when reasonable, or should courts have to provide accommodations when reasonable. I know whether it's in how you do consultations, taking breaks in a deposition or trial, trying to get different things like the jury instructions, what have you. All of these are accommodations that you might also be entitled to if it comes to that point as well. But that is kind of my criminal justice system overview. I know we could probably get into this a little bit deeper if you want to talk about what accommodations in the system look like, how we can talk about the system, how we can make sure that the criminal justice system essentially is something that's safe to interact with, and also what we do if we are witnesses to something. Because I know that can also be just as scary as feeling like you did something wrong, of being the good guys or the victim or the witness and having to recount what had happened to you and how to act through a trauma often informed lens. But I do want to switch gears because I do know there's a lot to cover, and I do want to talk about employment rights. I know that feels very opposite of talking about law enforcement, but it is something that's really important when we have these types of conversations, is that we are the most likely to be unemployed or underemployed. That's no secret for those of us who are very familiar with transition age stuff. And that really, when we have people who are employed, not all of us are paid for the work we do. This does go back to other policy considerations and bias, but one of the big policy considerations here when we talk about who's getting paid, who's working, is stuff like Social Security and Medicaid, that a lot of people might not take paid employment out of fear of losing their benefits of some way, shape, or form. But also, things that happen is we want to try to increase employment wherever we can. The private sector has made lots of great strides through neurodiversity and autism at work programs. And public policy also tries to help us, whether it is through 503 with those aspirational goals, protections against discrimination under ADA and 504, that there are things like the workforce recruitment program, which was usually open to recent college graduates with disabilities to enter the federal workforce. And the most controversial of all in this grouping is anyone who has a 14C certificate. And when it comes to 14C certificates, that's a little bit less relevant now, but it's something we're going to touch on because it's something that's probably and has been being phased out in Illinois, but now under the law that basically we can't really do a lot with 14C. So we're just going to kind of dive through this really quickly and what those rights look like with workplace accommodations, since this is the really big one where people don't know how to advocate for themselves and what to do, is really that under Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act, that we are unable to discriminate against somebody who is a qualified individual with a disability. This applies to employers with 15 or more employees. This also applies to labor unions, state and local governments, a little bit of everybody. you might want to check with the state to see if there's a civil rights law that is more restrictive. The ADA is always the floor, it's not the ceiling. So you can have pretty much any state say, oh, this cap on number of employees, it might be 10 people, it might be five. It can't be larger than 15 because this is the floor. And with disclosure, that's usually a big thing that shows up, but that's how you're going to usually invoke that you are a qualified individual with a disability is if you disclose that you're autistic or have a disability. And what happens under the law here, and what Title I really, really gets at the heart at, is that employers have to provide reasonable accommodations to individuals with disabilities anywhere in the employment life cycle, from hiring to firing. So whether that's in the applications, the interviews, onboarding, while you're working there, performance evaluations, promotions, termination, you name it, you have to have reasonable accommodations and anti-discrimination measures, except that it causes undue hardship. And when we think about some of these anti-discrimination things, there's also been lots of court interpretation over what practices are and are not discriminatory. For instance, there's a lot of court cases out there about personality tests in hiring. There's stuff about disparate impact with something like AI being used in hiring. There's so many ways and reasons that this is something that comes up in different situations and scenarios. But I do want us to be mindful that this is something that does pop up now and then. But when we do think about accommodations at work, this is stuff that should help an individual perform the essential functions of their job or role, which the law really spells out as basically anything that is a responsibility of the employment position or role that the person has or wants to apply for, or what the role will be. And I know we talk a lot about ideas for specific accommodations, and we might say, is this reasonable? Deciding if something is reasonable is typically on a case by case basis, as well as just kind of using some different tests under the law that usually employees have to prove that something's reasonable. That was cleared up with the Supreme Court, and basically that it can't be disruptive to the business. That's usually the big stuff that shows up. But the Job Accommodation Network is a great resource when it comes to these types of things to keep in mind and to have in our back pocket. So, how do we protect our rights at work, especially if you are someone who is trying to receive accommodations and you are denied? This is usually the really big thing that happens, is that accommodation requests are denied and people will email me freaking out saying I was discriminated against. It might not be that simple. It might not be that cut and dry. Usually, what I would recommend you do with your request, of course, if you have documentation, that's great. But if you are requesting accommodations verbally, don't be afraid to do this. And I do this with every time I do a verbal request, is send some kind of follow-up letter or email. You want to recap what was discussed and print a copy to keep it for your records and at home. Basically, if I requested an accommodation and they said, yeah, sure, of course I'll implement that, they might forget about that conversation. They might say that conversation never happened. So it's really important that you send a follow-up, or ask them to follow up with you, but I would send it yourself. I'd be like, "Dear so and so, it was great meeting with you yesterday about my accommodation request. As we discussed, I would like to have extra time on whatever. And we agreed that it will be implemented, yada yada. Please let me know what next steps are and when this will take effect." Like something just to that extent is enough to show that this conversation happened. It was followed up. It was a present sense impression because it happened almost immediately. And that also lets the employer have an opportunity to say, oh my gosh, this isn't what happened. We said we'd get it done by this date, or we said you'd get this specific thing. Really making sure you have that extra documentation, not just I submitted a bunch of medical forms and things from my doctor, is a great way to also protect your rights. And the other thing that happens here is if they grant an accommodation that's not what you wanted, they can still get away with this, essentially, because it has to be reasonable. That if I say I'm a terrible note taker and need note taking services, but you grant me a recording of this webinar instead of somebody else's notes, that might still be reasonable. That it might not be what you asked for. I might be able to try to advocate to still get somebody's notes, or to get notes or a summary of the webinar, because let's just say I don't have an hour to an hour and a half to watch a webinar back, but I need to know what the key points and what the most important takeaways were. because I watched the webinar and I missed taking notes because I just can't listen and take notes at the same time. It just doesn't work in my bird brain. But you might want to get their response in writing, especially if they deny your request. And usually, if they didn't provide it that way, when you ask for it in writing, it helps set up that this was definitely denied and why it was denied. That they might say it was unreasonable, or if they don't have a good reason, it might look like disability discrimination of sorts. And if you do feel there was some form of discrimination, retaliation, because that's the other big thing that shows up at work as well is equal employment opportunity issues. So, say you requested leave due to a disability, you get back from your leave and then you're immediately terminated. That might be some kind of equal employment opportunity issue, or that you might think this is retaliation. This is something in that you will probably want to seek help from an advocate or an attorney. I'm not saying to go to me, like we've talked about. I am just giving overviews. I am not licensed to practice in Illinois, but there is somebody who could probably point you in the right direction. And we also do have some resources at the end of today's training and webinar as well. But if you do feel there is a violation, definitely seek guidance from a professional on that because you don't have to go at it alone. And then there is, of course, the big one when it comes to employment and wages. I always like to touch on this just because I think it's interesting. And this is something that is a national thing that happens now and then. But this one I actually get to come to you guys with good news for. Because when we are talking about unfair labor practices and subminimum wage, it is being phased out of Illinois. That is wonderful to hear, at least if you ask me. And essentially, this is from the Dignity and Pay Act, or HB 793, and this was signed into law on January 21st. I believe prior to this, Illinois was doing work to phase out subminimum wage without legislation doing so. So they were just trying at like the local level, but legislation has been the biggest win here. 18 states have signed this legislation, and I believe we just got word last week actually that Georgia signed legislation. So when I talk about subminimum wage legislation, usually people assume this is going to be a very partisan thing. This is usually either bipartisan or nonpartisan, and there are also people who feel mixed on this. So essentially what happens with subminimum wage is that under the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, there is a loophole called 14C that allows authorized employers with certificates from the government to pay people with disabilities less than federal minimum wage. I don't recall exactly what federal minimum wage is, but I remember the last time I looked it up, it was somewhere in the $7.25 an hour ballpark. I believe it has increased since then, but I could be wrong. Things are all over the board when it comes to the federal government, as many of us know. So I always like to keep that in mind. But really, what happened here is it became a loophole to pay people less, or we would argue, it's okay because a lot of these certificate holders are providing employment opportunities and sense of purpose that otherwise wouldn't exist. I'm not singling out any specific 14C employers. 14C employers, if you're really curious who does it in your community and has done it historically, there is a publicly available list through the Department of Labor of who is a current certificate holder. So that might help inform your decisions. Usually it's nonprofits and things of that nature as well that are trying to provide job skills or employment opportunities to people with disabilities. And you have people who think it's a bad thing because equal pay for equal work, and you have people who think it's a good thing because of those different, ideas of having purpose and employment. So going from here, what you really want to see and what we want to advocate for in knowing our rights is knowing that you're not that pay disparities on the basis of disability are bad. That's something that could be viewed as discrimination under the ADA, but this is a special brand of pay disparity and discrimination, if you ask me. That was basically legal through the Great Depression recovery and somehow has survived for not like almost 90 years, which is wild to think about, if you ask me. But when it comes to knowing your rights broadly, I do want to kind of just talk about what that means and how we can do better too. So I do want to talk about civil rights resources just a little bit, and I know that we have plenty of time for questions as well. So if you want to know more about civil rights and different things that are important, that the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network has a lot of wonderful plain language guides. And a lot of these plain language guides will talk about things that are important to the community. It will explain different policy implications and experiences in accessible language that can be easily understood by pretty much anybody, whether you are someone with an intellectual disability or a second language learner or anything of the sort. Another big one is the National Disability Rights Network. This is something that was established by, I believe, federal law as well. And essentially, every single state has what is known as a protection and advocacy organization. I know there is a lot of anxiety around P&As and their budgets and funding right now, but protection and advocacy organizations are there to be a resource. They sometimes do take on cases of discrimination or civil rights violations pro bono for people with disabilities. I have served on the board of my state's protection and advocacy organization for several years, and I'm very proud of the work we have done, that we are the ones who have gone after different Medicaid waiver stuff. We are the same ones who have really pushed to get alternatives to guardianship enshrined in Florida. That there's so many great initiatives that come from there. And there's also different things as well. Like I know the Autism Society has a Justice Task Force and Justice Center. They are really trying to do more when it comes to criminal justice, especially. And we'll also talk about what your different legal rights may be. I know Autism Speaks also has some stuff. A little bit of everybody is trying to say that there's rights, and of course, that your autistic adults are entitled to full inclusion and participation, that we do have all of that good stuff, that we do have the right to be parts of our communities, to live in our least restricted environments, to have education, all that good stuff. And then there's the additional bigger concerns that we like to talk about. So Social Security and Medicaid, of course, is the bucket that I don't really touch. But the other really big one, and we could probably have had an entire additional hour on this, is guardianship and alternatives to guardianship. So, for those of you who want kind of a quick overview on this, and this is a big civil rights concern, especially for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, is being under a guardianship. And this is something that usually happens as a result of poor policy more than anything else. Guardianship is really a tool that is designed as a last resort for people who are incapable of making their own decisions legally. So basically, when you think of guardianship, usually we think of elders with dementia or Alzheimer's who just can't make those big life decisions or be involved in their care or their medical care or their housing or anything of that nature. And essentially, what happens with guardianship is it puts another person, whether it is a relative or a professional, in charge of that person's affairs. It is a very difficult situation to get out of, but I always talk about guardianship because it is disproportionately applied to young people with autism and other developmental and intellectual disabilities, and usually young people. And it's because a lot of the times we're not taught or told there are other options, and that a lot of families agree to it, thinking this is the only way I can still be involved in my child's health care and education after they turn 18, which is not necessarily the case. There's lots of great alternatives to guardianship, whether it is something like a power of attorney or supported decision making or person-centered planning or representative payees for Social Security. Those are just some of the options. That's kind of just a easy mode version. I usually get to geek out about supported decision making in particular. But these are things that show up, and that's one of the only ways that you can really lose civil rights as an autistic or disabled person. That most people don't recognize that guardianship can also strip somebody of things like the right to vote. It is one of the only ways nationwide and anywhere that you can lose the right to vote other than being incarcerated. That incarcerated people, depending on where you live, might not have the ability or right to vote. Guardianship will, in some cases, take away somebody's right to vote. Just a couple of things that I wanted to keep in mind when we have these discussions and different things to think about, different rights, different resources. And I know we do have time to talk questions, thoughts, concerns, or anything else you'd like to see in the future. I do thank you for bearing with me today, since today is one of those days I'm definitely a little bit under the weather. I had a wonderful time at the conference last week, but I came home and immediately was in bed sick for 3 or 4 days. And today's the first day I'm like able to talk. So I really do appreciate your understanding, your patience, your kindness, and I look forward to keeping these conversations going. I know that talking about advocating for yourself with law enforcement and at work is scary stuff. But I do want to make sure that we are keeping our communities safe and empowered however we can and inclusive. So again, I thank you and I look forward to keeping these conversations moving.
Awesome. Thank you so much. If anybody has any questions, feel free to type those in the chat or you can raise your Zoom hand and I'm happy to unmute you if you would like to speak to Hallie directly. And just to reiterate, this webinar is recorded. We will have the recording available to you. The URL for the recording will be sent out in the follow-up email tomorrow, along with a follow-up survey. And if you need a certificate of participation, you can feel free to email me. I've put that in the chat a couple times. Any questions? Got a couple thank yous.
Thank you all for participating.
Yeah, if you have no questions for Hallie, you can go ahead and log off. I'll close us out. Um, oh, here we go. Somebody did ask a question in the Q&A for police training on stimming. What does that look like?
That's a great question. So I always liked when I used to do the trainings, I used to tell law enforcement that you might think that if somebody's moving their hands a lot that or they're fidgeting with an object, you might immediately have that instinct to that it's dangerous. I think something else that a lot of police officers do is even just having autistic people interact with them in non-threatening or crisis-based situations is really big. So I know one of my local families has told me that they purposely went to the station one day and just talked to the officers just so their son knew everybody and they knew their son, like, hey, this is what he does. I know I always like to tell police officers, like, I know you're immediately making that assumption, but maybe if you approach it and don't talk about it, I know you're going to immediately think it's threatening. But if I have a fidget toy while you're talking to me, even recognizing, there's a good chance this person is fidgeting and they're not necessarily holding a weapon. I think that's a really big thing. I know it goes against a lot of officers' immediate instinct and training elsewhere, but really having that understanding of what stimming and self-regulatory behaviors might look like for autistic individuals is really big on essentially doing better and not immediately just perceiving a threat.
Awesome. Another question that we got is where can we find out other options to guardianship?
That's a great question. Your protection and advocacy organization might have a lot there. And I know lots of other disability rights organizations will talk an awful lot about guardianship and their alternatives. I don't know off the top of my head if Illinois has a supported decision-making law signed in, but it is something that I do like to kind of mention because I know some states do have that as a legally enforceable option, but really going through that with either estate planning or even just financial advisors and all other, there's so many people that kind of influence guardianship decisions that it's hard to get comprehensive information. I know if that's something that's of interest, I'm sure I can talk to the folks at ADA so we can have something a little bit more in depth that's talking about guardianship and alternatives to guardianship.
Someone says, when you say that guardianship can strip away someone's right to vote, does this mean it varies state by state? Just curious as to whether my son is not supposed to be voting since we have guardianship over him.
It could be state by state, and it could also be whatever you have from your court order as well. That I think a lot of people don't recognize that can be an interference, that there's limited guardianship, there's full guardianship, but in some cases it does take away the right to vote. Guardianship is usually is not federally governed, so it really doesn't matter at the state level or even just your specific case.
Next question is, have you seen school resource officers close the gap for police officers um, in terms of working with autistic individuals?
Not necessarily, because I've also seen school resource officers arrest kids for having behavior. So I've seen a little, especially in states where mental health holds are another possibility, that sometimes the arrest is safer for the child than being put into a psych facility, which is wild to think about, but that's a thing that happens in Florida sometimes is that school resource officers and classroom management ends up with these decisions of do we call the SROs and have an arrest per se, or do we put them in a 72-hour cycled involuntarily? And then the families can't like come get them or do anything. Like it's bad. Essentially what happens with school resource officers that you could end up having just bad policy get in the way, for lack of a better description.
Okay. Next question is somebody put, we are a project search site, which is a work program for students with disabilities. They get internships where they learn transferable skills and start applying for competitive entry level employment in the community. We still see about once a year employers asking inappropriate questions once in a while about what their disabilities are, etc. Also, we are seeing jobs getting scooped up so quickly right now with everything going on, and it is making it more challenging for our community to get jobs. Any advice for our interns applying for jobs during these times?
This is a great question, and I am a huge project search advocate and fan. We have project search sites throughout here as well, where I live. But when you talk about employers asking inappropriate questions, that's the one thing I regret actually not addressing a little bit more today, because that is something that comes up in the Know Your Rights, primarily because when you do get asked inappropriate questions about what somebody's disability is, your first instinct when I do know your rights is people go, oh my God, they can't do that, which is a foul of the ADA and can be discriminatory, but what you do with that question is what matters. Unfortunately, a lot of employers don't realize they're not allowed to ask those things or they're not supposed to, which means it unfortunately falls on our job seekers to spin those questions or refuse to answer them. Usually it's a tactical decision because of a power imbalance, but when somebody asks me those types of questions that they're not supposed to be asking, I will try to spin them however I can into making it a positive, which is because I'm interviewing because I literally need the job, right? Like I know that sounds horrible to say, and I can't just go, you can't ask me that, but it happens an awful lot. There's all sorts of things employers can and can't ask, if for those of you who don't know, and you aren't immediately going to go run and make an EEOC complaint. And I know, especially during these times, that's a little difficult too. And some advice for our interns applying for jobs right now. I wish I had something that's a little bit more uplifting and positive, but it's tough out there. I wish it wasn't. I wish we had more understanding employers. I wish we had more, and that more of our project search sites also invested in keeping our students after they graduate, quote unquote, from the programs. So a little bit that's on my brain, but a lot of it does fall on the employers, not so much our students. But except when it comes to when they do ask inappropriate questions and we don't always know what to do because we're in a situation where it's not always cut and dry, that we can't just say, this is bad, I'm making a complaint.
Right. Last question that I see here, unless anyone else has any other ones, is Ellen Lindsay asks, what helps autistic students the most? I'm not sure if she's referring to, I guess, just what helps autistic students know their rights the most, I guess, is what she's
I
asking.
think I think honestly just having not hiding the eight ball is that a lot of the times with Know Your Rights, the only time I've ever received anything about my rights growing up is that I was just told to respect authority and be good with law and basically don't make law enforcement's job harder, which is not what actually was important. I didn't know that until I got to law school that I don't have to consent to a search if they want to search my car or property. Like you don't have to consent. That usually we consent to things just because we think it's going to make things easier. This goes for everybody, by the way, that not consenting to a search doesn't mean you're guilty. It means that they are just hoping that you're just going to waive your rights and make their jobs easy in case, there is, even if you're like, oh, I have nothing to hide, I'm fine. Like if they pull you over and they want to search your car because they think you were driving under the influence, which happens a lot to autistic people because of behavior. I know it's happened to a good friend of mine a couple of times. They just automatically assume he's drunk. He's not. They'll search his car and they will look for any excuse, even though he obviously has no alcohol in his person. He's not drunk in the middle of the day, but he'll still, I'm like, you don't have to consent to that search. They don't have a warrant. There's no probable cause. You don't have, if they took a breathalyzer on you, you obviously are sober. Like things like that, that I think there's more need in the general public for as far as what your rights are when it comes to searches and seizures, for instance. I have a lot more awareness of these things having gone to law school, but that shouldn't be the norm. I do think as well, knowing like, how do I advocate for myself? What do I do if they say no to my accommodations? Do I just move on? Is this okay? Just having those answers spelled out, I think would help a lot of people because the only times I know in neurotypical environments as well, I've ever seen a know your rights of any sorts was for people who protest. I went to law school. I know that sounds redundant, but when you are with law students, they like to go to protests, they like to exercise their free speech. There were many different things. I knew people that were observers at protests and political events, and they would always tell them what their rights are if they got like arrested at a protest. That is not applicable to most people's everyday lives for the most part. So making sure we have everyday life skills when it comes to interacting with law is really important. And really get and also don't and how to advocate to just get stuff in writing. I know that seems pretty simple, but really that's helpful to understand why things are happening. If you might have something you need to think about further to make sure you remember things correctly. Just kind of, I think that's the stuff that's the most helpful, just at the very baseline.
Thank you so much, Holly. I don't see any other questions, but I do want to just say that I did put the follow-up survey for today's webinar in the chat. It will be in your follow-up email that you'll receive tomorrow, but I just wanted to go ahead and put it in the chat because I know for me, if I'm watching a professional development webinar or going to a training, I'm not going to take any kind of follow-up unless it's like directly afterwards. So I went ahead and put that in the chat for all of you. We do appreciate your feedback. And if you have any other questions or want to ask Hallie anything, you can reach out to her on Twitter. I believe she's very responsive, or X, I guess it's called X now. You can also email me, and I'm happy to connect you with her for any questions. And yeah, the recording will be posted. And thank you so much, all of you, for joining us today. Hope you have a great rest of your Tuesday. And thank you, Hallie. Hope you feel better.
Thank you so much.